Astronaut Adams in the space station was attacked by alien creatures. The monster got into Adams' body from its mouth, and in an instant, blood spurted out of Adams' mouth. The scary scene frightened Sanada. This is the first alien creature discovered by humans on Mars. At the beginning, alien organisms were still stem cells. After the biologist Derry successfully awakened them, they rapidly developed into multicellular organisms. People named it Calvin, and put it in the space station for research. An equipment failure sent Calvin into sleep mode. Derry tried to wake him up with an electric prod, but the awakened Calvin suddenly wrapped around Derry's right hand. Derry couldn't break free. Derry diverted Calvin's attention with the electric prod, but Calvin remained motionless. With a sudden force, Calvin twisted Derry's finger. Derry howled in pain. When Derry took out his hand, his right hand had been shattered. Calvin tried to break through the rubber gloves. Calvin used the broken electric shock rod to pierce the gloves and escaped from the experiment box smoothly. Calvin walked into the laboratory and was about to touch the mouse, but was bitten back. Calvin tightly entangled the mouse, dissolved and devoured it. Adams rushed into the experimental chamber and rescued Derry. Adams is wrapped around Calvin's legs. Rebecca hurriedly closed the door. For the safety of the space station, the monster must not be released. Frightened, Adams took the laboratory flamethrower and attempted to burn Calvin to death. But Adams was devoured by Calvin's counterattack. When Calvin emerged from the corpse, Calvin's size became larger. Calvin then escaped from the laboratory by exploiting a loophole in the fire protection system. Suddenly the communication system of the space station was paralyzed. Vargas decided to go out to repair the communication equipment. Unexpectedly, Calvin flew out from the launcher and entangled Vargas. Vargas tries to get into the spacesuit. Although Vargas can store a small amount of oxygen in its body, it cannot stay in space for a long time. Calvin entangled Vargas' leg, causing damage to the spacesuit's cooling system, and the coolant slowly seeped into the helmet. Vargas wanted to climb back into the capsule, but Vargas thought it was too time-consuming. Vargas decided to untie the safety rope and jump towards the hatch. Vargas held on to the hatch to keep from falling into space. However, the helmet has been soaked with a large amount of coolant, and there is a danger of suffocation at any time. When the hatch was about to open, Calvin suddenly rushed forward. Vargas slowly stopped the opening action. Vargas sacrificed himself, and could not let Calvin enter the space station. With Vargas falling into the infinite universe, Calvin can only find another entrance around the space station. In order to drive Calvin away, Sanada injected the thrusters over and over again, resulting in excessive fuel consumption. The orbit of the space station deviates, and it is about to crash into the atmosphere. After all, the safety of the Earth is the most important thing, and dangerous creatures must not be allowed to land on the Earth. Under the decision, Sanada let Calvin into the space station. The entire space station is filled with the breath of death. Derry fell into a coma after speaking.
Life's very existence requires destruction. But he has to kill us in order to survive.
Sanada noticed that Derry's legs were bulging. Rebecca opened Derry's trousers to find Calvin hiding inside, and Calvin had eaten Derry's leg. Calvin spread out, bigger and more ferocious. The team members scattered and fled. Sanada hid in the hibernation pod. Calvin circles the sleep pod looking for a breakthrough. Sanada looked at him, as if staring into the abyss, shivering. Calvin entangles the sleeping pod, and tries to break it. Calvin left abruptly. It turned out that no one knew whose wound was bleeding. Calvin came smelling blood, only to find Derry's body. Before Calvin could react, the hatch closed suddenly. It turned out that this was a trap set by David. Calvin was locked up. At this time, a space capsule was heading towards the space station. Rescue has finally arrived. Unfortunately, the docking door of the space capsule was the one that closed Calvin. David wanted to remind the people in the space capsule. Rebecca suddenly said that this is not to save them. It was just an unmanned spaceship. When the space station is invaded by creatures, the protection mechanism will be triggered to push the space station into outer space. Sanada, who was hiding in the hibernation cabin, climbed out and ran towards the direction where Calvin was being held. Sanada opened the hatch and was instantly swallowed by Calvin. Under the huge impact, the docking port of the space capsule broke suddenly, and hit the space station. Suddenly the entire space station was severely damaged. The life support system was paralyzed. and the oxygen was getting less and less. Under the reverse thrust of the space capsule, the space station is gradually propelling towards the Earth. Faced with a difficult situation, David opened an oxygen candle. Lower Calvin into the escape pod with oxygen, then quickly closed the hatch. David is going to fly into outer space with Calvin, while David's teammates board the only escape pod and escape back to Earth. Two escape pods in the universe passed each other and flew in different directions. David faced the terrible Calvin. His helmet was untied, and his body was gradually swallowed by Calvin. David and Calvin fly into deep space. The other escape pod passed through the Earth's atmosphere and fell into the ocean. The nearby fishermen gathered around and saw an unknown creature inside. The escape capsule system that was supposed to fly to the Earth suddenly failed, and the orbit was temporarily changed and drifted to outer space. David wanted to fly Calvin into outer space, but Calvin saw through David's trick. At the last moment, Calvin maneuvered the escape pod down to Earth. At the end of the movie, Calvin finally became a threat to humans on Earth. As Derry said, he is not an evil intruder, he just follows the instinct of life. But if alien creatures appear on the Earth, what attitude should we face?